Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to our webinar called Reimagining Power for a Healthy and Just State. This is our first webinar in the Looking Around the Corner series. And my name is Ashley K. Thomas. I'm the project manager here at the USC Equity Research Institute, and I oversee the Governing Power and Social Movement portfolio of work, and I'm so pleased to welcome you into this space. We would love for you all to introduce yourselves in the chat so we can get a sense of who we're in conversation with. So if you feel up to it, just drop your name, where you're logging in from in the chat. And just a quick housekeeping note, you can enable closed captioning by clicking on the live transcription button that's at the, I think it's at the bottom of your screen. So you can feel free to do that if that is helpful and accessibility need for you. And I see some introductions are coming in little by little. So thank you all for being here. I think we'd love to, while folks are introducing themselves, start with a land acknowledgement. So we want to, like I said, begin this conversation by recognizing that California is home to many, many Native nations whose land we're living on, and acknowledge that here at USC, we live on Tongva land, and we acknowledge that the land that we reside on is taken and currently occupied in a settler colonial society. We understand that it is continuously exploited, and it really has a deep impact on our Native kin and our family members, which includes stealing labor and knowledge and skills to build what we currently live in now. And we're going to be talking about California, so it's important to start by being clear about the context in which we reside in. And as we recognize the history, we also need to understand that it is current, it is happening right now, and we live on stolen land, and we have to think about our roles and responsibilities as guests on this land and commit to supporting the struggle for Native nation sovereignty and self-determination. So just giving you an opportunity as you're introducing yourself to also think about the land that you are on. Whether that means taking a moment to take a breath and acknowledge the land under your feet, or take a moment to learn at the link that's provided, nativeland.ca, which has native land across not just Turtle Island, but an expansive list of different Native nations. And we do this for a couple of reasons. One, to pay respect to the original caretakers of this land, past and present and future generations included, to raise awareness of the histories that are too often forgotten, and to affirm our commitment to racial justice, social change, and engagement with Native nations. And so thank you so much for allowing us to take a moment to do that. Again, feel free to introduce yourselves. You can add the land that you're on to your introduction if you would like. And we're going to kind of keep moving in this conversation, and I would love to introduce my colleague Jennifer to talk about the project that we're here to chat about, Looking Around the Corner project, and what brings us into this series. So Jennifer is the research director here at the USC Equity Research Institute, where she conducts research on a whole lot of issues. And if you don't know Jennifer, she's thoroughly brilliant. And she focuses a lot on regional inclusion and social movement building, and has authored a ton of reports, including being one of the co-authors of Looking Around the Corner. So I want to just bring Jennifer into the conversation and help provide some context for why we're here and some context for the report. So I'll pass it off to Jennifer.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you everyone for being here. I see from Brooklyn, Washington, D.C., San Jose, Fresno. So thank you all for joining us. This is our we're celebrating 15 years here as Equity Research Institute. We're celebrating 15 years of being in service and in solidarity with communities and movements who have been on the forefront of the fight for justice and liberation. And for the past 15 years, we've been providing research on a myriad of issues around economic inclusion and climate equity, around immigrant inclusion and racial justice, around movement and power building. And everything we do, from data analysis, collection, kind of the writing, the convenings like today, our communications, everything that we're doing internally as well to be a good and better research partner, is towards the day when our movements for justice are powerful, are well-resourced, and are able to work across communities, across our different sectors of civil society, all towards a healthy and just future. Today is no different. Today is convening. What we really want to do today is spur dialogue between all the different folks that are here represented. We have foundations, we have city government, we have health departments, we have movement builders, we have academics. And what we're really excited to do today is really to help spur some dialogue between you all, particularly about what are the strategies and steps that we can take collectively to steer towards that day, that future, when everyone is cared for and everyone has what they need to thrive. So to kick off our conversation, in January, we published a report looking around the corner, Reimagining Power for a Healthy and Just California. Maybe somebody can put the link to it in the chat. But we put together this report in January of this year, and it really offers 10 directions for the next 10 years. These 10 directions are our attempt to distill the wisdom from the field. What we're bringing to this is drawing on our own observations and experiences and learnings of being a research partner to movements over the past 15 years, and from a set of interviews that we've done with folks that we consider being on the leading edge of this field. We asked them about, what's your assessment about the current state of power building? What are your top priorities over the next 5 to 10 years? What are the possibilities if there were long-term investments in the power building infrastructure? And what are the challenges and threats? So this blueprint, what we've done is really drawn on efforts that are already underway. These are things that are already happening, that are seeds, are experiments, innovations. And our thought was, if we pull these out and if we really center these, if they just become the norm of how we do our work, we could dramatically shift the trajectory of our Golden State. So today is the first, as Ashley said, the first of a 3-part series. I just want to acknowledge the California Endowment. We've been partners with them on their Building Healthy Communities, and that we've drawn a lot of insight that from this report, that's distilled in this report, and they're also sponsoring this webinar series. So just want to thank them. So I'm going to kick it over to Manuel. We're going to have a presentation just to frame up the conversation, and then we're going to bring in folks from the field to actually have a dialogue, and then we're going to create some space for you all to meet each other and be in dialogue. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to our fearless leader, Dr. Manuel Pastor.
Thank you, Jennifer. Manuel Pastor, I'm director of the Equity Research Institute. I'm going to talk a little bit about this report. I always like to let people know when I get started that my voice might sound a little bit scratchy. It's actually because I have a voice condition called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around the voice cord that gets treated. It can make my voice sound kind of halting or ponderous or heavy. It's not intentional. For those of you who don't know about the condition, one of the bad things about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. running for president is that he's running for president. One of the good things about him running for president is he actually has this condition. And so his scratchy voice is what my voice would sound like if I didn't get it treated. I wouldn't be as delusional as him, but it's what my voice would sound like. So when, we face in the United States so many big issues, but I think that we face 3 fundamental crises. One is a crisis of multiracial democracy. Haven't had it for that long, and now the right, particularly of people of color, to participate in elections, have their voices heard, being stripped away in so many parts of the country, just as the country is becoming majority people of color. Second big crisis is the crisis of economic inequality. The way that the 1% has run away from the rest of us, the way the upper middle class has hoarded opportunities and shielded themselves, and of course, the racial wealth gaps that are part of that. The third big crisis is, of course, climate, illustrated by the wildfires in Maui, but illustrated by the heat waves that have been rocking the nation. And even as we have those three crises in the nation, we often do not have movements that are big enough, powerful enough, intersectoral enough to be able to really change the national dialogue. In California, which in many ways is America fast forward, we've had the benefit of movements that have tried to tackle these issues. And in fact, if you think about the progress that's been made on multiracial democracy in the state, not just expanding the franchise, but expanding access to undocumented Californians for resources and services. When you think about the fact that Los Angeles, where I am today, is ground zero for hot labor summer. When you think about the way we've moved forward on climate and climate equity, as imperfect as all of those moves have been, as deep as they need to go further in the future, all of the moves that have been made in the state have been fueled by fantastic community organizing that has shifted the terms of politics, that has shifted the narrative, that has created the possibility for a different state. But the state now is at a very critical turning point. How do we move from being a state of resistance to being a state of renewal? How do we take the promise of protest and change it into the reality of policy change that actually makes a difference in people's lives? That is what this report, Looking Around the Corner, is all about. And as Jennifer said, it's fundamentally fueled by really trying to be good listeners, trying to hear what the field is telling us about what are the critical issues and points of contention, and then trying to communicate that to our partners in philanthropy and trying to feed that back to the field. So there are many challenges in the state. We are offering in this report what we heard in the field about 10 key directions. They come in really three buckets. One bucket is about a blueprint for change. That's what I'll be talking about today. The other two are about that last thing I mentioned in the setup, which is that we've got these big crises, but we don't have movements strong enough, powerful enough, popular enough to really change the dynamic of the state or of the nation. And so you're going to hear in future webinars about how do we shift movement practices, how do we scale, sequence, and assess to be able to be more effective. Today, we're going to focus in on sort of the first four key directions. So if you could move the slide. So the first thing that we are trying to talk about is lifting up governing power as the North Star. As our also brilliant colleague, Ashley Thomas, reminds us, this is not the only North Star. If you think about our movements, there are really three kind of North Stars that are out there. One is the North Star of creating alternatives. That is worker co-ops, community land trusts, our own mutual aid societies, creating a world that we want to see, often in microcosm, small. A second North Star is resistance. It's really breaking a machine that oppresses, even if we don't have a plan about what is to come in place next. The third North Star is about governing power. And governing power is, as written here, an ability to set, win, and protect an agenda. It means contending in an electoral arena. It means moving policy in a legislative arena. It means understanding administrative power and trying to find allies in bureaucracy so that we don't just raise the minimum wage, but create mechanisms to deal with wage theft, that we don't just de-incarcerate, but put in place community justice and restorative justice programs that work and allow people to succeed. There's also contention in the judicial and economic and cultural arenas that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. I will say something about this governing power agenda, but one of the things that I really want to stress is that these other North Stars of alternatives, of resistance, are also part of our movement. And we need to figure out how to not argue which North Star is correct, but try to figure out how our movement as a whole can bring these things together. We think about the governing power because we think that time is so short to deal with climate change, to deal with protecting democracy, to deal with the economic desperation and racial inequality that was so sharply revealed by the COVID crisis, that we need to seize governing power and make an immediate difference in people's lives. Now, this movement toward governing power requires a cultural capacity shift among grassroots-led organizations that have been accustomed to being outside halls of power and decision-making, and making their demands for change through tactics that rightfully agitate and hold power holders as adversaries. How do we also have a relationship with those power holders? How do we develop systems of accountability? How do we develop leadership that can run for office and be held honest when they get in office? And final thing about this, and this is an admonition perhaps most for our partners in philanthropy. A lot of people like to lift up, rightfully so, the idea of building community power. We believe in that too, but it's important also to think about restraining the power of others to affect our agenda. One of the reasons why a wealth tax is good, it would raise money. It would deal with income inequality, but also it restrains the power of the wealthy to influence politics, and it's a measure of a shift in the balance of power. So we need to be hard-headed, even as we are warm-hearted about building big tents and alliances, but hard-headed about the fact that building community power is also about reducing the power of others who would derail a community agenda. Next slide. The second direction that we very much stress in this report is the need to address directly the issue of economic justice. There's been a lot of conversations, particularly in philanthropy, that sort of sidestep this by talking about healthy communities, that talk about racial equity, important issue, but fundamentally don't get at the fact that our economy is hardwired for inequality and hardwired to reproduce racial inequality. As Ashley was saying at the beginning, what else would you expect from a system that amassed capital by stealing labor and land, but a continued investment in the precarity of communities that are so important to so many of us? And this is an important issue because when you go to organizations that are working on health equity, that are working on restorative justice, that are working on a myriad of issues, they keep coming back themselves to the issues of economic justice and economic opportunity. And while we know that the antidote to racism is anti-racism, and that requires a conscious effort that I'll talk about in just a minute, we also know that economic scarcity fuels competition, and that this is part of a traditional economic agenda and framework that says that it's the economy, that says that equity is antithetical to prosperity, and that says that the economy should be left alone to business and the market to decide. We should be insisting instead that it's our economy. We should be insisting that dealing with equity will be key to our state's prosperity, and we should be clear that the economy is a political economy and that our movements have a role in voicing our view of what our economy should look like and creating the political conditions to make that happen. Next slide. We also think it's important to do something young people seem to be good at, which is to hold, unlike some of the older folks, myself included, to hold two ideas in your head at the same time. One is that we need to be focused on the commons, on building a broader we. And two is that we need to consciously center racial equity and specifically lift up the specificity of anti-Black racism and settler colonialism, anti-indigeneity, because those are the foundational systems of oppression in the United States. They set the terrain for other experiences, particularly of ethnic othering, of xenophobia that affects, for example, immigrants. And addressing that, making the investments in Black and Indigenous leaders explicitly and intentionally is key. And another part of this conversation is lifting up the issues of racism. Too long, those who've lifted up the questions of economy, which we just did, have said that we need to stress what we have in common, as though if we didn't talk about racism, it would disappear. What we argue strongly in this report is that we can't ignore, we need to inoculate. And the only way you inoculate is by having conversations on the daily, having practices on the daily that challenge anti-Black racism, anti-indigeneity, or you will fall prey to exactly what happened in Los Angeles nearly a year ago, when 4 Latino civic leaders were caught having a conversation that was filled not only with anti-Black racism in its tone, but in its agenda. And so unless we both center Black and Indigenous voices and promote the commons as we think about what is multiracial democracy, we won't be able to move ahead. Next slide. Now, in order to do this, we need to be paying attention to the development of new narratives. Narrative is power. It's what shapes the way we think. If you think about the power of what happened with the protests around the murder of George Floyd, maybe not for everyone on this phone call, but prior to that, if a Black person in a community was abused by a police officer, for many people in the United States, their first thought might have been, I wonder what that person did. But after the murder of George Floyd, the reaction rewired was, my God, the police are at it again. We need to be conscious about the rewiring. We need to be conscious about creating narratives that help to shift people's scripts, the way they think about things, the way they interpret, how they have a movement perspective. We need to understand, as I mentioned before, it's just a great habit to stop talking about the economy and start talking about our economy. It's a great habit not to constantly portray fairness and inclusion as special interest issues, but talking about how those are central. And in doing this, something we'll talk about a little bit more, we need to understand that that narrative can't just be for the already woke. It has to be a narrative that appeals, that does not move to the middle, but moves the middle in the direction of understanding the importance of racial equity, understanding the importance of community power building, understanding the importance of constraining the power of corporations and the wealthy to decide what's going on, understands what it is that we need to do going forward. So that's our first 4 directions. Next slide. In the presentations to come, we're going to focus in on the questions of shifting the structure of movements and movement practices, not our thoughts, but what we're hearing about, hearing about the need to balance healing justice with external impact, the ability to anticipate backlash because we know what's going to occur, the need to acquire a decision around making choices and sequencing. We're also in another set of sessions going to be hearing about the need to scale up and the need to come up with assessments and tools to make us judgments that let us know how effective our movements are being. And with that, I will end 1 minute early, which will deeply surprise Ashley Thomas, who spent most of the prep with me, warning me that I could not go over to 20 minutes that she had allotted. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Manuel. That was an amazing summary of the report. There's a lot more content in the report. There's a lot more content that will be coming. But we really wanted to spend some time going deeper into the conversations about power by bringing in one of our partners in this work who has done an amazing amount of work theorizing around power in particular. So I just wanted to bring in Tammy Bangloo into the conversation. Hi, Tammy, welcome. So Tammy is the Director of Programs at Grassroots Power Project and has spent decades working to build the new left through grassroots movement formations and really working to make history. Like, Tammy's amazing if you don't know. And at GPP, Tammy takes the lead on state alignment work in California and in the climate sector. So I just wanted to thank Tammy so much for coming and joining us. And I'm wondering, Tammy, if you can tell us a little bit about Grassroots Power Project and then how you all theorize about power and how that fits in, is different than kind of what Manuel has been talking about, but really just kind of how you all think about power and why it's so important in this moment right now.
Yeah. Hey, folks, again, thank you for that, Ashley, and thank you, ERI, for both all your work in the state and nationally to help our movements also theorize the big questions. And also in that sense of helping us dig deeper to the actual also data that allows us to move the work and policies in California. So Grassroots Power Project, we accompany social movements. So that means it's taken from the Latin American word, we walk alongside social movements in that sense of, and we really focus on state alignment tables. So the community organizing and racial justice sector that's experimenting with electoral politics as part of their organizing and policy and legislative work, their ongoing organizing, experimenting at scale, right? And so it of the sector to really start to craft collectively together state strategy. Right? And doing that in such a way that builds a stronger multiracial working class whole in US politics. And then we also support national formations that have a reach inside these key states. And so I have the benefit of supporting alignment work like the Million Voters Project, like the California Green New Deal work inside California. So I really want to appreciate both not just this paper, but also Manuel and Jennifer and Ashley, you guys have been trying to also theorize governing power. So Changing States was actually a really important document for us. We're coming out with a governing power framework that really tries to build on your changing states to help movements think about key pivots that need to be made. So I really want to press this real push for governing power, but I just want a few comments to add some nuance and texture to it. A lot of our movements, you've got to understand, moving for governing power means we've got to seize power as the system currently exists. It's not created for us. And in actually moving, taking candidates, looking at city councils, looking at school boards, looking at state governments, and on, right? You do that in such a way that then you work to devolve power. Right? We want to create new systems, new structures that can serve our communities better. What might that look like if we actually can create not just restrictions on capital, but popular control of the economy? And we can only do that if we can actually move the levers of government, right? And then, so if you're seizing, power as it currently exists, you're using your position and movement to try to actually devolve power so that the folks closest to the problem can begin to shape what that looks like. And then you're actually moving a new paradigm of governance, right? And so that is a shift away from neoliberalism, which, Manuel's been talking about the role of the 1% and dismantling rights and protection, moving an ideology about the free market, about individualism, about anti-government, and then using race and gender to, basically drive wedges through our communities, right? We've got, and they've done that through privatization and deregulation. We've got to come up with a different piece. So I think the focus on power is really critical for us. And I know we're super anemic to it, right? But at the core, it's a power proposition. We don't have enough power to win. We're waging resistance, right? And that's about building power, but we don't have enough power to actually create alternatives at scale. We don't have enough power to move the legislations that we want and the structural reforms that are needed. And we don't have enough power to really govern, right? And so at the core, we need to build power. And so I just there's three things I think we need to start to do as a movement. One, we need to assess our power. Let's just have some honest conversations about the power we have and don't have. What's the power of our opposition? Who else has power in this society that we'll have to ally with? What are other forms? So we need a much stronger assessment of power, starting with our own and starting to have actually real honest conversations with each other about how much power we have and don't have and how we're trying to build power, right? The second thing is that we need to start moving. Our movements are really good at the 1 to 2 year level. We know what we're trying to move 1 to 2 year, but our agitation, our vision is at the 50, 100 decades out. So part of our work in supporting and accompanying social movements is to really help folks with the strategic orientation. And it's about crafting strategy. So what we want to focus on is having our movements strengthen our muscle and developing mid-range agendas. What are we trying to do in the 5, 10, 15 years that connect the 1 to 2 year immediate practices that we have with this longer term vision, agitation that we have, and start moving and thinking about what we're trying to build. So to us, we want to make power building as important as the win. And actually, to tell you honest truth, based on some of the concessions we have to make, I'd rather lose forward. If that means we grow in narrative power, we grow in our organizing power. So then I think the third piece, and then I want to open it up, is I want to share a slide with folks. I think in addition, I really appreciate what ERI is putting out around focus on governing power, really lift up multiracial democracy and particularly Indigenous and Black power, communities and organizing, and then thinking about narrative shifts that we need to make, right? I want to add just one more. And obviously, Manuel named a bunch of arenas of struggle that we need to be engaging in, right? And particularly, we want to build power in those arenas. But I want to lift up one more fundamental power that I think we need to be practicing in the next decade in our movements, and that's united front power. But in order to do that, we actually have to engage in more strategic alignments. So this slide that I'm showing is that most of our organizations, our formations, are really comfortable with coalitions. That's what we practice in. They're tactical alliances of organization. So by its nature, they're short-term. They're very fixed. We want to move this together. And that's how we practice being, bigger than our individual organizations. We've been really trying to encourage people, particularly the social, the community organizing and racial justice sector. You've got to start building stronger alignments. And that's strategic alliances of organizations. That's by its nature, looking at what we can move short term, but that we're also planning to relate to each other and deepen our trust and our ties and our practice, our strategic practice for the long term, right? And I'll say this, is that, Alinsky organizing, Saul Alinsky, who wrote Rules for Radicals, they said, hey, no permanent enemies, no permanent friends. I fundamentally disagree. If we just continue to function as our single formations and single organizations, we will not have enough power to win. There are broad united fronts moving, and there can be objective united fronts, like a popular united fight to, basically protect multiracial democracy and take on the right. That's a popular front that I want to be a part of, right? And that means they're going to be tactical and strategic forces of often conflicting social blocs. That's just the reality, because you're trying to unite all who can be united towards a particular goal. Tactical means short-term, middle, and strategic being long-term, right? And in order to move into these united fronts, we need to develop stronger strategic alliance of organizations who will look out for each other's interests. In California, that's the Million Voters Project. It's Dignity in Schools California. It's the California Environmental Justice Alliance, right? Each one moving specific, or, we're grounded in deep organizing in our regions, or we hope deep organizing in our regions. And then we need to connect and move together, right? And that allows us to move into these united fronts as a bigger block and hopefully provide more strategic leadership. So that would be my addition to some of the other powers that you've listed. And I've taken enough time, but I'm looking forward to this series of conversation and digging into where we can grow and build our muscle as a movement.
Thank you so much, Tammy. I want to bring Manuel back into the conversation and see, Manuel, if you have any questions for Tammy and the ways that she's really bringing us together and thinking about the relationships that we need to bring long-term, mid-term, and short-term strategy together.
So many questions. So I really appreciated one of the all 3 points, but the first and the third, the need for honest conversation about the assessment of where we're at, which is why I started with, we've got these gigantic crises. The planet is cooking, and, we got an Inflation Reduction Act. That's good. But how do we really go big and make our movement strong enough to face this moment? Part of it gets to something you were talking about, Tammy, which is this united front power. And I want you, if you wouldn't mind, to explore 2 things. One is, what's the narrative strategy that needs to happen there too? Because the united front means uniting with people who have a different story in their head than us, and we want to be able to change their story. That's why I consciously use that term, move the middle, rather than move to the middle, because it's not about whitewashing or moderating, but somehow capturing the imagination. So what's the narrative work that needs to happen there? And then what are some other big pieces of work we need to do to make our movements more powerful?
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. What you're saying is, we think about narrative power as the ability to shape common sense, right? It's what people think and how they make sense of the world. We move ideologically, right? In that sense of how we think society works and governs, and then how we then make sense of the world and then impact people's worldview, right? So I think the first practice for our movements, we're often movement facing. We face each other. We talk to each other, we build with each other, we critique each other, we use terminology, and partially it means let's pivot to society as a whole. So in our narratives, we're going to have to be creative. That means, yes, we got to be counter hegemonic. So instead of, if neoliberalism is moving to like individualism, pull yourself up by your bootstrap, then we've got to think about popular narratives that move interdependence, that we're actually like relying on each other. And if they're using race and gender as a way to slice and pull wedges in our communities, then we need to think about like, you know, interdependence as a way not to work around it, not to ignore race, not to ignore gender, but slice through it. And so partially that means that our communities are up for grabs. They're not like, you know, they're like, oh, well, let the community decide. Which portion of the community? You know, if I'm organizing the Viet community, most of the Viet men have voted for Trump in the last round versus voting, you know, majority for Clinton the previous year. And that's because the right has been moving narratives that speak to them, right? Patriarchy being a very profound one, right? And so like, we need to think about one being, you know, you know, in that sense, society facing, you being really creative and thinking about, don't take our communities for granted, speak to them, try to organize everyday working people to be part of our movements. And that will take struggle because we're conflicted in nature, right? So if you're just looking for the activists who are down with us in our politics, then we're going to be about the size. But if you're actually then pivoting to society as a whole, contesting on the terrain of ideology and trying to win people over and, you know, and deal and, you know, struggle with the conflicting nature of where our community is to try to win them over to our worldview, to try to win them over to our vision of the society you want to build, the alternatives we want to build, to our alternative, you know, systems and structures of governance that we think we're going to have that's much more popularly rooted, et cetera, all those things. That means we got to get down there and organize. And I think narratives are really important. So I just want to say one more thing. If you're trying to move these specific powers and play in these specific arenas, like the legislative arena, like the administrative arena, like the judicial arena, then you've got to think about not just building power in those specific arenas that force you to play in certain ways, right? You've got to think about the other powers that you can begin to leverage that then allow you more power in those arenas. And that's particularly organizing power and narrative power and united front power. In that sense, that if you want to move in the legislative world, you build a bigger base, you come with a bigger we, and you actually move narratives that are popular with everyday people that begin to win people over, you're going to have more power in those arenas. So I think the way in which we're asking folks to think about is actually get concrete. What's your assessment of power? What's your assessment of power in all these different ways? What's our narrative power? What's our organizing power? What's our united front power, right? And then what are the specific powers we want to build? Administrative power in these arenas, how we stack up and how do we leverage these other powers to help us move in those arenas? So
one thing I think is particularly brilliant about that is that sometimes we look at leaders and we say, gosh, they came up short. And you know what? Sometimes they do. But it's often that we are coming up short with changing the political conditions that would allow them to make decisions that are actually not that bold because the political conditions changed. And I think that also comes from sort of looking inward rather than looking to society and saying how much power needs to be built. I want to ask you another question. It's kind of bubbling up in the Q&A. And I want to put it in a particular way. You know, I started by saying about California moving from a state of resistance to a state of renewal. And there's a way in which California is way too proud of itself and what it's done. I always say in Spanish, there's that great expression, se cree muy muy. He believes himself to be very, very. He's conceited. California se cree muy muy. So you get a perspective around the country, and you started it by talking about what you're borrowing from Latin America. What can California organizers, power builders in this moment learn with humility from what's going on in other states? Georgia's deeply impressed me, other countries. What can we learn that would get us out of our own bubble and really let us expand our horizons?
I mean, you know, I've been really curious about Chile. You know, a couple of years ago, there was a 50-cent raise in the bus fare, right? And they used that that raise in the bus fare to not just to fight for more buses, cheaper fares, but they made it a referendum on the dictatorship. You know, they're like 50 pesos. Well, let's look at the last 50 years, right? And the you know, in that sense of it was a crisis. It actually called on the legitimacy of neoliberalism. So they turned that 50 pesos raise to a move on looking at the last 50 years of the dictatorship and neoliberalism. And they didn't just back it with then a popular narrative. They then went to every single community and won elections. And then they won the ability to rechange the Constitution. Now they're actually in a struggle of power because the other forces still exist, right? And so they're now shaping and contesting. But that to me is like one of the greatest things. It's like we're presented with, you know, a fight, you know, and what folks talk about building like the third reconstruction, a real social safety net to lift folks out of the economic disparity. But that was just beautiful in that sense of moving and shifting the narrative, right? Making it a referendum on the dictatorship and then backing it up with everyday organizing and moving towards governing power as a way to shift the Constitution and then right inside be able to undo some of the tenets of the dictatorship and neoliberalism. And they're right now in a, you know, but basically they're juggling for governance. I look to that, right? I just got back from Colorado, and Rise Up Colorado and the alignment table in Colorado has labor, AFL-CIO, SEIU, the Colorado Educators Association, right? And so a lot of like, because it's a power proposition, they know labor and community need each other. And so they're beginning to strategize with each other. You know, I think in some states, labor thinks it can move alone because it can't. And in some states, community actually, in that sense of our ability to continue to build and through unity, struggle, unity, right? We're going to find much more alliances with the rank and file in the unions. We're trying to move because in some instances, the labor has the ability to negotiate directly with the governing bloc in that state, right? But we need folks for labor to see the importance of community and vice versa. It's like that, looking at that power proposition. So I'm looking to states like that are creating, you know, innovating, but doing it in such a way that's grounded in terms of community power, racial justice, and forcing the unions at the table to actually agree on some of those demands. And that's beautiful to see, right? And so those are just two examples, Manuel, that I think we should be looking at and studying and seeing what may fit in our time, place, and conditions.
You know, I think we know that you need to jump off a few minutes early, and I'll let Ashley say a word too, but I can't fully impart how deeply we appreciate you being with us today, but how deeply I appreciate having known you now for a couple of decades and being able to learn so much from your pioneering work on the ground and the full recognition that it's the work on the ground that provides the theory to actually do the work. I think too often academics think that theorizing happens in the university. And what I've learned is that we should just go out and write down the really brilliant shit people like Tammy are saying, and then add a few footnotes. So that's our job. Footnotes are us. Can't thank you enough for being with us today.
Thank you. And I agree. I couldn't agree more. Let's be practice rich.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tammy. We really appreciate you. And, you know, this has been an incredibly robust conversation. I've been like literally taking notes, learning a whole bunch. And we want to bring the rest of you all into that conversation as well. You know, this is, like I said, been a robust conversation on the multifaceted dimensions of power. And so we're going to bring you into some breakout groups, actually. And we wanted you to answer kind of the following questions. What was striking to you? What was missing? And what questions do you have? And so we're going to bring you all together in breakout groups. And we also want to think about this as an opportunity to sharpen your questions with each other and engage with new folks. And then when we return from the breakout groups, we're going to do some questions and answers with Manuel, myself, maybe Jennifer. We'll see who jumps in. And you can begin to drop questions into the Q&A box at any time. But think about this time as an opportunity to get to know each other and to ask really sharp questions. Welcome back. Welcome back. I hope you all had some fantastic conversations in your breakout rooms. We are hoping to spend some time doing some questions and answers. So if you had some questions that emerged from your breakout groups, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box so we can respond to them. We have a couple questions already queued up from the conversations that we've already been having, but we would love to hear a little bit more about the questions that you brainstormed in your group. While you all are kind of adding those to the Q&A box, let's start with just a little bit of questions around the United Front that Tammy really kind of brought into the space. Maybe Manuel, you can speak a little to this. Someone asked, when you're talking about the United Front, is this primarily focused on an organizational level, a personal level? Is it more broad? What are some good examples of what's happening today, in addition to kind of some of the things that Tammy touched on?
Well, I think a united front structurally is multi-organizational, multi-sectoral, and multiracial. And I think that, as Tammy mentioned, it brings together not just the usual suspects, but the unexpected allies. And I think we see glimpses of this occurring. I think the hot labor summer here in LA right now, which has got hotel workers and city workers and writers of Hollywood scripts and actors all thinking of themselves as workers and understanding a common struggle against CEOs whose pay increases have become extraordinary, and understanding that they should have the right to assert control over our economy, slow the pace of artificial intelligence, create the conditions for more housing, which is one of the hotel workers' strikes. So it's also multi-issue. I think we see this with, and it's got a very important narrative piece to it, which is understanding that everyone's economic future is at stake in those struggles. I think we see it in carrying across generations, which has tried to link together older U.S. folks aging with folks who are the immigrant and Black, usually almost all women, workers who provide the care, with the sandwich generation that's often middle class and working class and in the middle. And there's a sort of story there about care and a set of common issues and an attempt to rewire the narrative. I think we see some of it around climate and climate justice, particularly Justice 40 at a national level. But I think we're in a race against time, a race against time to save our planet, a race against time with the ways in which, just a word about the technology. You know, if you think about artificial intelligence, it's not really that intelligent. It's not really that artificial. It's basically stealing. It's using large language models to scrape the internet, to grab what's commonly held as knowledge, and then to create pseudo robots that can answer questions and displace people from their jobs. That's like the way in which, at the inception of capitalism, the commons were enclosed and people were displaced. That's coming on us right now. So I think we've got these boutique examples in the context of a tsunami of change. And I think, how do we lose our fear of getting big to face those challenges? Now, I'm not saying everyone's fearful, but I think that we often worry about being quite politically correct rather than how do we create a united front to come up to scale to solve the problems. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And I think some of the things that we talked about when we were writing this report is the process of coming together, the process of being in struggle also helps us create more power and propel us forward. And that we almost, if we think we have to go in perfect, then we're missing the point of the practice of democracy, of working together to build collective power, and like what building a united front actually takes, but what it gives to us is the skills as well. I want to bring Jennifer in and kind of bring a different question that folks are asking in the chat about philanthropy. I know we have some philanthropy folks on the phone. We're in conversation with this report with philanthropy. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the role of philanthropy in the past and kind of the future, and how we think about kind of their role in the next 10 years? Particularly when we're thinking about anti-racism work, we're thinking about the conversations of economic justice, just a headline or two about kind of the role of philanthropy.
Sure. I mean, I think some just broad trends that we're seeing. If I were to just take a step back and really think about kind of high level trends that we've been seeing in philanthropy, I think maybe when I first joined and started doing this work of looking at the role of philanthropy and models of social change, at that time it was starting to shift from really, let's take health, for example. It was starting to shift from, okay, we don't have enough philanthropic funds to be able to address the healthcare service needs that are needed. Like, what do we need to do to get upstream from health services? And that led to advocacy, right? Oh, okay, we need to do policy change. We need to think about what are some of those policies, budget priorities that will actually, some of those levers to be able to help open up more services for folks. So it's kind of working upstream from there. And I think what we're seeing now is an even further working upstream to the actual root causes and powerlessness being seen, and racism, global capitalism, all of these as being kind of the deep entangled roots that are upstream from poverty, poor health, unemployment, right? So I think that this is where kind of our experiments need to be. And we need to think, I just also want to recognize that there are a lot of folks from government here as well. And that one of the critical challenges that we need to come to, that we're really speaking into with this notion around governing power and the different facets of it, is that we need to really address the anti-government sentiment that is so widely held within our society. And I think that's a real place where philanthropy, service providers, organizers, academics can really work together to kind of lift up what is the role of government, what is the role of businesses, right? I think this feeds into kind of that united front that how can we really be broadening the forces to be a counterpoint to come rally around the changes and the roles that we all have to play towards a healthier future and more just future.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. You actually jumped into what my next question was going to be, which is kind of around the anti-government narratives that we're kind of confronting. And these are decades narratives in the making. Manuel, is there anything else you want to add about kind of the narratives of our relationship to government, particularly local government, as sites of contestation for organizers, and kind of what narratives we need to develop as a part of the narrative power strategy?
There's a beautiful quote in this report not of our words, but of the words of someone we interviewed who said, what we're trying to prioritize moving into the next decade is being able to show what it means for the state to be an extension of us. What does it mean for a state to care for its people instead of agitating against us all the time? If we're always thinking that the state is always going to be the enemy and we're always organizing against it, then what does a state look like that actually cares for its people, and how do we build that? And I think getting there is the role both of local government officials to open up the processes of democracy and participation of all residents, and the role of organizers to open up those processes and to seek to figure out how to overcome that distrust. In a book that he participated in writing, Solidarity Economics, we talked about how the default answer for conservatives is usually the market. Not of housing, let the market do it. Racial discrimination, the market will compete it away. Even the environment, which is a clear market failure, let's do cap and trade. The left too often says the state or the government. The government will do housing. The government needs to combat racial discrimination. It's the government that will go at the environment. And actually, that's probably true. The government needs to do all that. But people from the right don't trust the government, but people from communities of color don't trust the government. I mean, we saw that during the pandemic when well-meaning city and state agencies showed up with resources in communities that said, I mean, you've abandoned us for a couple of decades, and now you're here with testing and vaccines. What's that about? So to us, the answer is us. In every instance, housing, we need to do social housing, but we need to work with organizing to overcome NIMBY attitudes. On racism, we need government policy, but we need to do the political work to bridge between communities and for people to recognize how essential combating anti-racism is. On the climate issues, part of the reason why we're not dealing with it is because the worst effects of climate are felt by the most vulnerable, low-income communities and communities of color. And because some of the worst effects of it will be faced by our children, who apparently we don't care about. And unless we create the habits of connection, the depth of us, that's what's going to lead us to trust government. When we know that government is an extension of us, and it will be that only when we do the organizing and the bridge building, the movement work, the power building that our leaders are calling for, that this report calls for.
Thank you so much, Manuel. I really appreciate that. I wanted to get us out on time. We are just about transitioning to the end of our session. I just want to appreciate everyone for being here and the folks in the future who will watch this video. We really just want to appreciate you all and your contributions and your connections. We wanted to take a second to appreciate all of the organizers and thinkers who made this report possible. I'd like to say our work is to be a mirror back to the field about the work and the brilliance that they already bring. So we're happy to play that role. Definitely want to thank our staff and our support team behind the scenes, making all these little switcheroos happen. Lauren and Paris in particular, but a whole bunch of other folks. And just wanted to remind folks that this is the first of 3 sessions. The second session that we're going to be hosting is going to be in October. I think the date is the 17th, but we will send you a link to RSVP when at the conclusion of this meeting. And it will be focused on the commons that Manuel started to talk about, the commons of the power building ecosystem, and the skills that will be needed to be invested in, to be developed in order to bring about transformative and lasting change. It includes the discussion of the new inside-outside strategy, which we're calling, these are the strategies rooting in healing justice, the ability to anticipate backlash, and the discipline of choice making and sequencing that will come in the future. And December will be our third session. So please follow us to learn more. And we just really want to appreciate you and appreciate all the folks that made this possible. And thank you. With that, thank you and have a great afternoon. And yeah, we appreciate you.